The room waited for him, the way dim, forgotten places do when they have carried too much silence for too many years. Dust clung to the walls like a film of unspoken memory. A faint draft slipped through a cracked window, stirring old police tape that had lost its color, its purpose. The floorboards still held the outline where the body had once rested, an absence shaped into a presence. And in that fragile void, the investigator stepped back inside for the first time in decades, as if crossing the threshold of a memory he had avoided too long. Her name had been Liora Hale, age 27. Her background had once been simple, born in a small Illinois town, worked part-time at a local print shop, attended night classes in design, lived quietly. But something about her life had drawn an edge around her final days, a tension now preserved in police records and unspoken regrets. She had been found here, in this narrow room above an abandoned hardware store, sometime in November 1980. The case had slipped into cold archives without warning, without progress, without justice. The investigator paused after a few steps. The light barely reached the center of the room. Shadows pressed into corners where no one had looked in years. The air felt motionless, like time itself was holding its breath. He carried no bravado, no dramatic intent, only the quiet weight of returning to a place he once promised he would never abandon. His gloved hand brushed the wall, feeling the fine grain of dust. It felt like touching the past through a thin veil. No sensitive or negative words, only the sterile, muted language of a crime long left in darkness. Fragments of old dialogue flickered unbidden. Nothing else. Just the print marks and the time of discovery. Then we close it. Even back then, the silence had felt premature, artificial. And now, walking again through the room, he sensed the same faint echo of something unfinished. He crouched near the floor where the chalk mark had once been drawn. A cold draft moved across the boards, stirring faint remnants of sawdust from the hardware store below. He listened to the soft shift of old wood, the whispering tension of a building that had watched too much. A file folder lay on a crate near the far wall. He'd left it there decades ago after the final walkthrough. The corner had curled with age. He opened it carefully, feeling the weight of each faded page. Liora's last photo rested on top, a grainy, poorly lit image taken hours before the scene had been cleared. Her face remained calm in the picture, almost serene. No dramatics, no distortion, just a life interrupted without explanation. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogged faintly in the cold air. He wasn't here to solve what had already been deemed unsolvable. Not exactly. He was here because something had shifted, some small piece of information had resurfaced, nudging him back into a story he thought he had left behind. Still he moved with controlled stillness, each step measured, cinematic packing, slow, investigative. He allowed the silence to stretch, to speak in its own way. This was where the case began again. And this was where the guilt, quiet but persistent, returned like a familiar shadow. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The evidence had arrived 3 days earlier in a sealed envelope marked with a modern timestamp. A DNA analysis request from the state lab, flagged with a notation he had never expected to see tied to the Hale file. The envelope now sat on the floor beside him, opened with clinical precision. Inside, the printed sheet carried a message so simple it seemed almost unreal. New genetic profile extracted from preserved trace material. Match found. The lab had identified something on one of the old samples, an overlooked trace from the original collection. Not contamination, not mishandling, simply missed, buried under limitations of the era and stored in a container that had avoided degradation long enough for new methods to find what old methods could not. He reviewed the document again, eyes tracing each line. The match had triggered automatically against a recently updated database. A name appeared, not familiar, not expected. A small line of text that demanded the case be reopened. He had not spoken when he first read it, only stared at the paper, letting its implications settle with cold finality. Now in the old room, he slid the DNA report beneath Leora's last photo. The proximity felt symbolic, though he refused to let symbolism guide his investigation. Precision mattered. Clean reasoning mattered. Emotion would be present only as quiet, lingering atmosphere. He noted the time. The building creaked. Leaves brushed faintly against the window pane. Reopening a case required procedure, retrieval of archived material, new evidence logs, reauthorization. But beneath those formalities there was something simpler, something almost human. This was a chance, uncertain and delayed but real. He lifted a small evidence box he had carried in from storage. The cardboard was reinforced but worn. He removed the seal and opened the lid. Inside were objects preserved since 1980, a fabric scrap, a bent metal clip, fragments of paper from a handbag, a few personal items that had belonged to Liora. All catalogued, all familiar. He treated them as if handling fragile memories. The past was not sentimental here. It was structural, layered, demanding attention. A faint smell of old paper rose as he lifted the first item. Not unpleasant, just aged. The scent of archives and time. He placed a notebook on the crate beside him. Its pages had yellowed slightly, but the ink remained legible. He had forgotten some of the details Liora had written, brief sketches, reminders, a few phrases about upcoming projects. Nothing outwardly significant, yet everything in such cases mattered. A voice from decades ago floated through memory. Look at the edges. People leave more truth in margins than in the center. He had dismissed the phrase back then. Now it returned with subtle weight. On the last page of the notebook, near the bottom margin, was an incomplete line. Not a message, not an accusation. Simply a time and a location, written without context. He didn't react. Instead, he photographed it, logged it, and placed the notebook aside. The DNA match pointed towards someone entirely different. Someone who, according to the report, had never been interviewed at the time. Not overlooked, just never considered relevant. But relevance changes with new information. The investigator's gloved hand traced the outline of the evidence box. Something inside tugged at memory. A photo from the original scene. He remembered the angle, the lighting, the accidental reflection on the window pane. He pulled it out gently. The edges were rigid from preservation. The image captured a portion of the room, focusing on the area near the window where faint marks on the sill had once been noted but never fully explained. He examined it again, still nothing obvious. Yet the DNA match suggested that something small, something seemingly insignificant, had been there all along. He set the photo down. The room seemed to shrink slightly around him, as if the past were drawing closer. "Reopen it," he had said earlier that morning, handing the lab report to the case supervisor. A nod. A pause. Then a simple, quiet response, "Understood." And with that, the Hale case moved from forgotten file to active investigation. Here in the abandoned room, the story shifted, slowly, methodically, without theatrics, a reconstruction of moments that had been left unresolved for too long. He inhaled once, deeply. Then he reached for the old binder of reports, preparing to trace the path of a case that had never truly ended. 3. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. He opened the binder with measured care. The metal rings creaked faintly, releasing the smell of musty storage. Each report had been typed on beige paper, the text crisp despite its age. He flipped through the early entries, initial response logs, scene sketches, statements taken in haste the night Liora was discovered. He laid the pages across the crate, aligning them in a methodical grid. Structure created clarity. Clarity created progress. The first report described the building layout. A staircase leading to the second-floor room, 2 small windows, a narrow hallway with peeling paint, no signs of forced entry. That detail had once been treated as an endpoint. Now it felt like a starting point. He circled the phrase, "no forced entry." If Liora had let someone in, then the person had been familiar enough to enter without hesitation. But the DNA match contradicted that assumption. It pointed to a name he didn't recognize from the old suspect list. He reviewed the early photographs again. Scene markers, angles, reflections. The camera flash from 1980 had cast faint shadows that modern digital tools might enhance. A thought formed, not emotional but logical. He made a note. Request digital enhancement of legacy photos. Then he returned to the reports. One statement stood out, the word brief noise. A neighbor had reported hearing something, not distress, not struggle, just movement, the kind that might accompany someone leaving quietly. That had been dismissed as inconclusive. He reread it twice, letting the simplicity settle. Another page described items missing from Liora's bag. Nothing valuable, a small card, a folded paper, not theft, not motive, just absence. Still, absence could be meaningful. He turned to the timeline. The final confirmed sighting of Liora had been at a corner store 2 blocks away. The clerk had offered only fragmented dialogue. She looked tired. Didn't say much. Bought paper, ink. Those words had not held significance before. Paper, ink, the notebook, the margin note. He felt a faint shift, logic aligning with memory, forming connections without forcing them. He flipped to the last section of the binder, where follow-up interviews were stored. One page had a handwritten annotation in the margin, his own, from years ago. Check transport logs. He blinked once. He had no memory of writing it. But he must have. The handwriting was unmistakable. Yet the follow-up had never been recorded, maybe lost, maybe forgotten, or maybe drowned under other priorities during the case's final weeks. Now that overlooked notation felt like a thin thread connecting past intent to present necessity. He studied it, letting the weight of the neglected detail settle. The building creaked again, as though acknowledging the rediscovery. The wind outside shifted, brushing the window with a low hiss. He leaned back slightly, letting the silence form its own boundary around his thoughts. Every cold case had a fracture point, an unnoticed angle, a small detail ignored because it seemed too minor to matter. And in cases like this, the truth lived in those fragments. Liora's story had waited 45 years for someone to notice the margin lines, the overlooked annotation, the preserved trace. Now with the DNA match, the case held shape again. Slowly, precisely, without melodrama. The investigator closed the binder, grounding himself in the steady rhythm of the work. The next step would unravel the past further. But for now, he stood in the cold room, listening to the faint echo of his own breath, preparing for what came next. He spread the reports, photographs, and the new DNA document across the old crate with measured movements, arranging them like a quiet constellation. The room held steady in its dimness, the draft now barely perceptible. This was the stage where possibilities began to multiply, not dramatically, but through subtle shifts in the evidence, through patterns emerging in slow, deliberate form. The original suspect list had been small, too small in retrospect. Only 3 names had been examined closely in 1980, each carrying a motive of varying strength, each dismissed eventually due to timelines or absence of direct proof. Now, with decades of distance, those names felt like shadows rather than individuals. He placed the first file on the crate. 1. Noel Sutter, a coworker of Liora's from the print shop. His motive had seemed simple, a disagreement over a work schedule, a hint of tension during their last shift together. But his alibi had been confirmed by 2 others, and the record showed no inconsistencies in his statement. The investigator scanned the original interview transcript. Noel's responses were brief, clipped, uncertain, not rehearsed, just hesitant, a young man answering questions he didn't fully understand. Did she seem worried? I don't know, maybe tired. That's all. Yeah, just tired. No tension, no anomalies. Still, he marked Noel's file with a thin yellow tab, review again, not because of new suspicion but because cold cases demand discipline. No assumption is safe. Next came the second file. 2. Arlen Drew, a maintenance worker who lived in the building next door. He had been one of the last to see Liora walking home the night she disappeared. His alibi, a late shift at the factory, had been supported by time stamps on entry logs. Straightforward, clean. He examined the factory logs again, tracing the numbers down the paper. Precise, unbroken, nothing appeared altered. Still, he added a blue tab, reconfirmed timeline. 45 years changed everything and nothing at once. The third file felt heavier, though the paper carried the same weight as the others. 3. Cal Morton, a night class acquaintance, a creative field student with a quiet manner. He had attended the same design course as Liora. They had exchanged notes, shared occasional conversations, nothing more. His alibi had been the most uncertain. He claimed he was home alone that night, working on a project with no one to confirm it. The original investigator had noted inconsistency in his tone, not deceptive, just unclear, the way people speak when memory and truth shift under pressure. But no evidence had tied him to the scene. No trace, no connection. The current investigator read the transcript slowly. Cal's pauses stretched between lines. She left early that night. How early? Not sure. She say anything? No, she didn't talk much. The emptiness of the exchange lingered. He placed the file aside, marking it with a red tab, evaluate alongside new DNA lead. But these 3 were not the only possibilities now. The DNA match had expanded the investigation beyond the original frame. The new name, one that appeared nowhere in the 1980 documents, had redefined the field. He unfolded the printout again, eyes narrowing slightly at the match result. Name Rael Corin. Age at the time, early 30s. Connection to case, none recorded. Entry in database, routine submission from unrelated investigation. No motive, no mention in the notes, no adjacency to Liora's life. Yet the DNA on the preserved trace was his. The investigator wrote the name on a separate page, isolating it, not as a conclusion, just a variable to be tested. Logic demanded patience. A match did not equal cause, it equaled presence, and presence required explanation. He turned to the wall where faint marks had once been noted. They were nearly gone now, absorbed by dust and time. He raised an old photograph beside them. The alignment wasn't perfect, but the angle suggested someone had leaned there, briefly, near the window, possibly watching the street below. He considered the suspects again. Noel, tension but nothing more. Arlen, proximity to the area. Cal, uncertainty. Rail, unaccounted presence. 4 threads, no hierarchy yet. The investigator moved through the room, stepping carefully, listening to the old wood respond beneath him. Each suspect carried a different rhythm, different motives, different alibis. None fully convincing, none fully dismissible. He glanced back at Leora's photo. Her calm expression in the image gave nothing away. She had lived simply, but simplicity did not prevent complexity in those around her. He exhaled quietly, letting the stillness settle again. Somewhere within these threads lay the truth, and one of them had left a trace, so small it escaped detection in 1980, yet preserved long enough for modern tools to reveal it now. The case no longer felt cold, it felt waiting. 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. He returned to the files with renewed precision, shifting each document until a pattern began forming, not immediately clear, but present in faint lines and repeated details. Cold cases rarely hinge on dramatic revelations. Rather, they unfold through small alignments, through the careful recognition of quiet contradictions. The first clue surfaced in the old notebook, a detail that had seemed trivial earlier. The margin note with the time and location. It repeated faintly in one of the witness statements, though phrased differently. A neighbor had mentioned seeing Liora leave the building earlier that week at a similar time, carrying a folder under her arm. The statement had been archived without emphasis. He placed the notebook and the statement side by side. The connection was not overt, not loud, but it suggested a pattern of scheduled meetings, routine, unspoken, possibly private. He wrote a line under the comparison. Recurring movement, purpose unknown. He then examined the DNA match again. Rail Corin. No records tying him to the print shop. No mention in the night class roster. No link to the building. Yet the match was clean, consistent, reliable. Why had he been near the scene? He reviewed a transport log from 1980, a page he had once intended to examine and never did. Rail shipments passing through the area, a maintenance entry signed by R. Corin. He paused. Not shock, just quiet recognition of convergence. Rail had worked in the region, though not in Leora's immediate circle, a logistical worker passing through. No reason to know her, no evident intersection. And yet, intersection exists where routine overlaps without acknowledgement. He underlined the log entry twice, not dramatic emphasis, just precision. Next came another subtle detail. The factory log confirming Arlen Drew's alibi contained a minor inconsistency. The timestamp at entry was clean, but the timestamp at exit had a faint double mark, an overwritten digit barely visible, possibly clerical error, possibly something else. He enlarged the photocopy, studying the variation. The line of the overwritten digit deviated slightly from the others, not conclusive, not strong enough to shift suspicion fully, but enough to revisit. He wrote, "Exit log, verify authenticity." Then he examined Noel's transcript. Something about the way he described Leora's final shift, tired, appeared again in the night class record. 2 different people used the same description, not concerning by itself, but repeated descriptors across unrelated sources sometimes indicate shared observation or shared assumption. He flipped to Cal Morton's transcript again. His tone in the interview had been uneven, not conflicted but uncertain. A person speaking carefully, perhaps too carefully. Cal's alibi lacked structure. He had been alone, working late. A plausible scenario, but his timeline had one small deviation, a half-hour gap he struggled to explain. These were not accusations, only fractures. Emotional tension reveals itself through hesitation, through repeated language, through incomplete timelines. Yet the most meaningful inconsistency came from Hale himself, not from testimony, but existence. His presence at the location was unexplained. The DNA match placed him near the scene, but nothing else tied him to Liora. The investigator touched the photo again. Something in the angle near the window intrigued him. Hale's occupation involved tools, transport, routine repairs. The marks on the sill, faint symmetrical indentations, could align with the shape of a portable tool handle. He examined the photograph under the faint light. The reflection at the edge showed something else, barely visible. A shape behind the camera's flash, maybe a figure on the street outside, unrecognized at the time. Clues emerging slowly. He cataloged each. Margin notes. Repeated descriptions. Transportation logs. Overwritten digit. Unexplained presence. Faint reflections. None alone meant anything. Together, they formed a lattice of implications, not emotional but structural. He felt the shift internally, not excitement, but a quiet tightening of focus, as if the case were turning its face toward him at last. These inconsistencies spoke to something deeper, conflicts between truth and recollection, between routine and secrecy. The suspects were no longer static names. They carried interior tensions, quiet fault lines. He wrote one final line before closing the binder. Clarity follows accumulation, not assumption. Then he prepared to follow those accumulations where they led. 6. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. The twist did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as logic, an intersection of details aligned through patience rather than chance. The kind of truth that emerges from slow, attentive investigation rather than dramatic confrontation. He returned to the DNA report. Hale Corin. The match remained unquestionable, but presence alone did not denote cause. He needed to reconstruct the path that led Hale into Liora's orbit. He traced the transportation logs again. Hale had been assigned to routine rail maintenance during the month of Liora's final days. The route passed directly behind the hardware store building, but there was a second note in the logs, one written in faint pencil. A marking indicating a temporary stop. A repair that had lasted longer than usual. A delay matching the date near Liora's final notebook entry. The investigator leaned over the crate, viewing the old documents at an angle. The pencil note lined up with the margin time written in Liora's notebook. Not coincidence, not randomness, alignment. He compared the handwriting from Hale's maintenance signature with the pencil notation. Slight differences, slight similarities, enough to be examined further. But he paused, recalling a detail from one of the old interview transcripts. Not Hale, someone else. Cal Morton had mentioned hearing Hale activity that night, an unusual volume of movement, he'd said. The comment had been archived as ambient noise, not significant. He opened Cal's transcript again, reading slowly. She left early that night. Did you hear anything unusual? Just trains, more than usual. The phrasing felt too certain in hindsight. How could he distinguish more than usual, unless the activity held meaning for him? Then the investigator remembered the half-hour gap in Cal's timeline, the unexplained absence. He cross-referenced the times. Cal's missing half-hour aligned exactly with the marked delay in the transportation log. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but within minutes. He wrote a single line on the page. Cal's timeline intersects rail delay. He exhaled once, steady. The twist was not rail, not the man whose DNA was present, not the new match who appeared suddenly in the record. The twist was Cal, quiet, polite, uncertain. The one who had left no physical trace because his involvement had been shaped by subtlety, not force. He had used Rail's repair stop as movement cover, approaching the building when sound masked presence. Rail's DNA trace, taken from the preserved sill, had been from routine maintenance earlier that week, transferred unintentionally when he leaned near the window during repair work. The preserved sample had captured presence, not action. The investigator realized this slowly, logically, through accumulation rather than leap. Cal's connection to Liora, night classes, shared notes, quiet conversations, held emotional undertones that never surfaced in the original investigation. Not conflict, not intensity, something quieter, a tension unspoken. The margin note in Liora's notebook. It matched the time she met Cal earlier that week for project discussion. The repeated descriptions, tired, quiet, reflected a pattern of emotional withdrawal, something she might have expressed only in glimpses. The reflection in the old photo, a figure near the street, could plausibly match Cal's height and outline based on old measurements. Piece by piece, the alignment grew. He wrote, Cal's presence equals unreported. Cal's timeline equals gap. Cal's awareness of rail activity equals specific. The final connection came from a detail nearly invisible, a small card missing from Liora's bag, the design reference card she shared only in night class, something Cal had spoken about months earlier. It was never recovered. He closed his eyes briefly, the silence wrapping tightly around him. Cal had been overlooked because nothing outward suggested involvement. No motive had been assigned. No conflict had been recorded. But emotional logic operates quietly. People act not through spectacle, but through internal fractures that leave small, deliberate traces. The twist existed in that quiet space. The least suspected person had intersected with every small inconsistency, subtle, almost invisible. The investigator opened his eyes again. The truth was not loud, it was structured. The case had turned. The investigator stood alone in the dim upper room, the quiet settling around him like a final layer of dust. The files, photographs, transcripts, and notes lay arranged with clinical precision across the crate. Everything aligned now, subtle clues forming a structure that felt steady, inevitable, and quietly devastating. He reviewed the sequence one last time, not for certainty but for clarity. Cold cases deserved that kind of deliberate closure. Cal Morton had not been violent, chaotic, or unpredictable. His life had shown no outward signs of tension. There were no loud disagreements, no recorded conflicts, no visible motive shaped by pressure or impulse. What he carried instead had been internal, quiet, layered, unseen. The kind of emotional strain that moves beneath the surface of daily life, silent yet persistent. The investigator traced each detail with slow, measured attention. The half-hour gap in Cal's timeline. The steady, almost rehearsed calm when he described hearing more trains than usual. The way his recorded pauses stretched across the transcript, as though weighing each word before releasing it. The absence of the design reference card, a card connected only to their night class interactions. The faint reflection in the old photo, indistinct, yet consistent with his height and position. And most telling, the alignment between Leora's margin note and the unrecorded rail delay, a window of time Cal understood because he had been near enough to hear it. Each detail carried no weight alone, but together they held a kind of structural integrity, truth formed not by dramatic revelation but by careful assembly, a quiet architecture of logic. He stood very still, hands at his sides, feeling the cold of the room pressing against him. The air held a muted scent of aging wood and forgotten paper. Outside, the wind brushed faintly across the cracked glass, a soft, thoughtful whisper. He didn't imagine the past. He didn't dramatize it. Instead, he reconstructed it the way the evidence required. Cal had followed Leora up the narrow stairwell during the quiet window created by the rail delay. He had spoken softly, hesitant words, uncertain fragments, a conversation shaped more by emotion than clarity. She had listened, quiet as always, but something in her silence had carried weight. Maybe she had withdrawn from shared work. Maybe she had expressed discomfort. Maybe she had grown distant from an unspoken connection Cal had internalized in ways no one else noticed. Emotion lived in small places, and small places leave small traces. What happened after that was not explosive, not loud. It had likely unfolded in minutes, quiet tension escalating into a moment neither fully intended nor fully understood. The scene held no signs of struggle because the moment had not been built from spectacle. It had been built from restraint, confusion, and the weight of unexpressed tension. Cal had left quietly, descending the stairs during the maintenance noise outside, the sound of metal on metal masking the shift of old floorboards. He had walked into the evening without leaving a clear mark behind. No fingerprints, no distinct trace. Only the absence of the card and the faint imprint his figure left in a reflection no one studied until now. Meanwhile, Rael Corin's DNA on the windowsill had misled the early investigation simply because it was too precise for the time. A perfect example of how clarity can obscure truth when context is missing. Presence is not action. Trace is not intent. Certainty is not meaning. The investigator gathered each document and returned it to the binder. The pages slid together with the soft calm of paper aligning after long separation. He secured the metal rings, shutting them with a restrained click. He sat on the crate for a moment, feeling the weight of the decades, the silence, the oversight, the slow erosion of memory. The room around him seemed unchanged, but he knew what it carried now. The truth, reconstructed from method and patience. A truth quiet enough to stay hidden for 45 years. He pulled out his small notebook and wrote the final summary line. Case resolved through accumulated logic. Recommend closure with supporting documentation. There was no triumph in the line, no closure shaped by relief, only the mechanical precision of duty. Cold cases rarely brought satisfaction. They brought conclusion which was different, technical, necessary, bare. He stood and walked toward the narrow window. The glass had clouded over time, holding a faint haze that softened the street below. The wind shifted slightly, carrying distant sounds from the rail line, metal resonating against metal, a low rhythmic echo from a system still operating after decades. He imagined Leora walking this same street years before, carrying her notebook, her design materials, her quiet presence. He imagined Cal too, moving through life with the understated calm of someone unnoticed yet perceptive. Their paths had crossed in ways no one documented, in ways even they might not have fully understood. Truth rarely arrives with certainty. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it gathers in corners, collects on surfaces, accumulates in margins. Only through method can it be arranged into something visible. He looked at the old outline on the floor, nearly erased by dust. A shape preserved only in memory and faint discoloration. He stepped around it, careful, respectful, treating it the same way he treated every piece of preserved evidence, as if it were a quiet echo of a moment that once carried weight. He reached for the door but paused, letting the stillness sink into him one last time. The room would remain here long after the case moved into updated archives. The dust would settle again. The crate would empty. The marks on the sill would fade further. The building itself would one day be replaced, its memory absorbed into new walls, new floors, new tenants. But the investigation, slow, deliberate, methodical, had restored something that had been missing since 1980. Not spectacle, not dramatic justice, just clarity. Before leaving, he reflected, not with emotion but with calm introspection, on the nature of truth. It doesn't present itself in sharp lines. It hides in hesitation. It lingers in misunderstood pauses. It waits inside overlooked notes. And sometimes it lies beneath another person's trace entirely, disguised by the routine motion of daily life. He switched off the small lantern he had brought in, returning the room to its original dimness. Shadows eased back into their places. The silence stretched outward, no longer heavy with unanswered questions, only holding the faint echo of what had been reconstructed. He stepped into the hallway, boots pressing carefully against the old, tired boards. The corridor smelled of dust and aged paint. Each step carried a muted creak, the building acknowledging his departure the same way it had acknowledged his return. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused again, making a final note in his book. Truth isn't always visible on surface. It forms where patience meets structure. He closed the notebook gently. Outside, the evening light waited, pale, muted, steady. The wind moved through the open yard with quiet, rhythmic motion, carrying the distant metallic hum of the rail line. He walked forward, leaving the building behind without looking back. The case was closed. The truth was quiet. And something human, soft, unresolved, lingering remained.